Before I get into talking about this novel, I need to show you the author photo. I can't believe I haven't featured this before. Look at this. What a boss, right? Maryse Condé is described here as the grande dame of Caribbean literature, and on the back she is described as the queen of Caribbean storytelling, and this photo really reinforces that message, doesn't it? My friend Kate remarked that this looks like that classic author photo, sort of reclined with a cigarette, but she's not actually holding a cigarette here. So Maryse Condé is a prolific writer and critic from Guadeloupe. Her numerous books often explore the African diaspora, which was caused from slavery and colonialism in the Caribbean. And now, in her late 80s, she has written what has been said to be her final novel, although can we really believe that? I mean, you have some writers like Anne Tyler who declared a number of years ago that she'd written her last book, and she's continued producing book after book. So we'll see if this is actually her last novel, and it has now been listed for the International Booker Prize. So let me get into talking about the actual contents of this book, because I'm afraid I have some opinions. It's a parody of the New Testament in which we follow Pascal, a mixed-race boy born in contemporary Martinique. He's abandoned at birth, and his adventures play upon the life of Jesus. Many of his experiences and people he encounters have direct correlations to the Bible. Numerous occurrences involving Pascal are rumored to be miracles, although there's little actual evidence to support this. But nevertheless, he still acquires a large following, a group of devotees and disciples, as well as quite a few detractors. Although he was adopted, Pascal embarks on a quest to discover his true parentage, his birth mother who converted to Islam, and his father who is a guru that runs an ashram. As he travels to many different locations, he also engages in a number of affairs with different women, which mostly end in disappointment. By drawing upon a number of different religions to inform his journey, Conde questions what the role and purpose of such a messianic figure might have in the modern world. So, this novel is fairly readable with some evocative descriptions and interesting ideas, but I felt like the structure of it doesn't allow them to be developed enough, because it self-consciously gives an exaggerated version of events from the Bible. This begins to feel routine, and it restricts the novel too much. It cycles through variations of Lazarus being raised from the dead and the sudden appearance of multiple loaves of bread to feed a large wedding crowd, and a variation of the Last Supper in which Pascal washes the feet of his disciples. And this quickly grows to feel tiresome and a bit too on the nose for me, especially because Pascal himself is presented as a character that is very naive and hapless and dull. He has some banal epiphanies, some of which show his outrageous ignorance, and as an example of that, I have to read this passage in which it said, "He had thought India was a land swarming with men and women sentenced to a life of famine. On the contrary, he had been dazzled by its extraordinarily rich culture. He had also realized the diversity of the world and the complexity of its problems." While I'm guessing this is satirizing his small-mindedness, it makes it difficult for me to empathize with him as a character. There are some more interesting characters, such as his adoptive mother, Eulalie, who really enjoys attention from the press, and his charismatic and ambitious gay friend Judas, who Pascal might have some romantic attraction towards. Potential storylines are rapidly abandoned, such as when a mute boy named Alexander goes missing after Pascal is charged for looking after him. The problem is that the novel moves on at such a rapid pace that these potentially interesting dynamics aren't fully explored. There's also an uncomfortable relationship between this novel and the religious text that it draws inspiration from. Christian holidays and the life of Jesus are acknowledged as happening, but nobody in this book notes the increasingly ridiculous parallels between the lives of Pascal and Jesus. There's one scene in which Pascal meets the equivalent of Mary Magdalene, and Judas objects to him fraternizing with her. And Conde writes, Pascal replied absent-mindedly and in a gentle tone, "Let he who has never sinned cast the first stone." Used to his mysterious and incomprehensible words, Judas Ulauther made no objection. Why would this statement, one of the most famous lines from the New Testament, be mysterious and incomprehensible to Conde's character, who must be familiar with the Bible? I know this novel is written as a parody, but it's difficult to gauge from the tone of the story what relationship the characters and situations are meant to have with the real world. So in following the New Testament so closely, I didn't feel like this novel came across as compelling or emotionally involving enough. Similarly, many people rally around Pascal as a new Messiah, but there seems to be little justification or reasoning for them to believe that he'd be this. References are made to Pascal teaching classes and assembling disciples, but it doesn't feel like this would be far-reaching enough to invoke the kind of near hysteria from a group of many devoted followers from all around the world. There's the potential for his life and message to reach more people with a television debate, which doesn't actually materialize, and his self-published memoir, which is very poorly reviewed. And it's interesting because I think Conde is questioning this very issue that I'm raising at one point, and it's noted, why did he arouse so much excitement? Why did the unlikely adventures of a new Messiah destined to harmonize the world get so much coverage? Why did some people take sides with him while others held him to public obloquy? People were nurtured by a void and a malaise that no elections by universal suffrage could satisfy. They felt that neither the elected nor their ministers represented them. This is an interesting statement, but it doesn't show the reader any tangible reasons why so many people would rally around Pascal except through local rumors. For example, it felt like Conde could have built upon this being a modern story with having his fame being spread through the internet and social media. And perhaps none of this lack of realistic detail should be taken seriously, because this novel could just be read as a satire of how any Messiah that appears today with a well-intentioned message of peace would inevitably be hopelessly overwhelmed with the complexity and nuance of problems in the world. Unfortunately, I don't think this needs to be stated in novel form, because it mostly came across to me like a conceptual exercise without enough humor or wit to keep me compelled. Interestingly, there's a minor character in here, and it's said of him that he is well known as a painter, and his paintings were extremely popular since they were an explosive mixture of sacrilege and religious beliefs. For example, he had painted a series entitled Virgin and Child, where one canvas represented a black woman, one an Indian woman, one a Dougla, one a Sabine, one a Caprese, a mulatto woman, and finally an octoroon, each holding a lovely black infant. It's an interesting idea worth stating, and I feel like Conde is doing something similar in her fiction by presenting Pascal with his mixed heritage as a modern-day Jesus. But I'm not sure this novel conveys anything that much beyond this fully justified perspective, which diverges from traditional representations of the Messiah. If it's saying that we're not progressing as much as a society, as much as we think we are, it's only pointing out examples which are already obvious. There are many notable writers, such as Jose Saramago and Philip Pullman and J.M. Coetzee and Norman Mailer and Callum Toynbee, who have felt compelled to write fictional variations of the life of Christ with varying results. Perhaps authors that reach a certain status feel it's necessary to comment upon the modern meaning and questionable relevance of one of the most influential religious stories. But in the end, I'm afraid I felt that Conde's text was more an interesting exercise rather than a satisfying novel. But of course, this has been longlisted for the International Booker Prize, and so I think it's interesting to go to see what the judges have said about this book, why they have picked it for this list. And it shows on the Booker website comments from the judges about all of the books that have been listed for this year's award. So they say of the Gospel according to the New World, Maryse Condé is one of the greatest Francophone authors and the great voice of the Caribbean. Yeah. In this book, she proves again what a gifted storyteller she is. The narration is lively and fluid, and we feel carried away by this story as we do by the fables of our childhood. She takes liberties finding references in the Bible as well as in Caribbean myths. The book borrows from the tradition of magic realism and draws us into a world full of color and life. This is a book that succeeds in mixing humor with poetry and depth with lightness. So a couple of things about this statement, which I think is really good and does characterize the book, but I just had a different feeling and reaction to the book. So they begin by noting about Conde's reputation, and it must be difficult as a judge coming to an award and thinking, if you've read this author before and were aware of their reputation, to come to a novel completely objectively, and but this award really is about this one novel. So hopefully they're not taking this as a kind of lifetime achievement award about an author that is in her late 80s and wanting to award her for that. But I don't think they are, because if you look at other books that were eligible for this year's award, there's a lot of other very famous authors whose books weren't selected and nominated for this year's prize. So they do obviously think that this is a very strong book. But also the note of sort of referencing magical realism. And my understanding of magical realism is that this is a form of literature which contains within it its own internal logic, even though there are some really fantastic things that can occur to the characters in the book. All of these things make sense, but I feel like how this novel is laid out, and some of the more outlandish things that occur, that there are sort of jumps in logic, and it doesn't contain that as much as I would hope to in a book that is using magical realism, if in fact that is what Conde is doing in this book. But it is interesting to read the judges' opinions, and I think it is somewhat unfortunate that this is actually the first book that I've read by Conde. So maybe if I'd read some of her other books, I would have had a different feeling about this novel. But as it is, this is the only book so far that I've read by her. But I do definitely want to read some of her back catalog and some of her more famous and influential books. So if you have any suggestions, if you've read Conde before and have any suggestions of books that you think I should read next by her, please let me know about that in the comments below. I'd be really eager to discover more of her work because she is definitely a distinctive voice that has this kind of sly sense of humor to her writing, which I do really appreciate. However, I felt reading this book on its own came across more like a box being ticked. But that's just my feeling about this novel. I would love to know if you've read this book and if you have a different opinion from mine, if you agree with me or disagree with me. I would love to hear about that below as well. Or if you're interested in reading this book now, please let me know about that in the comments below. But yeah, it was interesting to read this, but I am really eager now to read more books from this year's long list of the International Booker Prize. So I'm going to get on with doing that. Thank you for watching, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye bye.